to allow for it, I think in Kentucky, for research only by universities. And that was due to Rand Paul basically pushing Mitch McConnell and then a couple others getting that passed. But again, the Tennessee law goes against federal law. It's also been legalized in Colorado, South Carolina, and Virginia are working on it as well. The one, my favorite, is the Firearms Freedom Act. And the Firearms Freedom Act basically says that all guns that are made, manufactured, and stay within the borders of whatever the state is are not subject to unconstitutional federal gun regulations. 9 states have passed it, including Tennessee. There are many others that have introduced this bill, including Glen introduced this back in 2011, I believe. It was introduced again in 2013 in the House and got about 26 co-sponsors. But somebody named Tom Tillis, I believe was his name, decided to put that aside so that it wouldn't go too far. Again, 9 states have introduced that, or passed it, I'm sorry, and many, many others have introduced it. And you have to remember with all these nullification bills is the federal government needs the assistance of the counties, the cities, and the states to complete their laws. They need that. They don't have the resources to follow through with laws. All right, I'm going to speed up here. Georgia passed a bill recently nullifying Obamacare in the state. South Carolina passed an Obamacare nullification bill out of the House, but failed in the Senate. I have here that South Carolina, I said that before, passed a hemp legalization bill. Missouri is doing a lot of stuff, Obama nullification, anti-Agenda 21, firearms freedom type bill, hemp legalization, that are all moving forward. Another issue is here in North Carolina that's sort of, I wouldn't call it nullification, but they're going to legalize raw milk. A lot of people here probably grew up on raw milk.
I tried that in 2011.
Well, he's going to call it natural milk because raw is too controversial.
Yeah.
So anyways, I believe that a state level focus is practical. The state legislature cannot hide from us and lives and stays close to where we live. They cannot hide like a federal candidate, as the state legislators are closer to your home. So I'm picturing pitchforks and torches. Number 2 reason why I believe we should focus on the state level is we can focus on neighboring areas that we live. Maybe your state representative isn't that good, but there's a guy right over here. You can go help out at the neighboring county. State legislators are easier to beat. It takes less manpower and money, which are the main things that are needed for a campaign. Number 4, a door-to-door campaign is more attainable since the mapped area is relatively small, obviously. The federal government, in my opinion, will likely never police itself. It was never intended to police itself. The check on the federal government was to be the states. The states were the final check against tyranny on top of the 3 branches. As a final check, the power was further decentralized and separated, therefore checked by placing the majority of power in the states. It is up to you and I to rekindle the fire of liberty by pushing from the ground up to stop the growth of the federal government. We need good constitutional candidates at our state and local level, and we need good activists as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. All right, next up I'd like to introduce Glenn Bradley. We're going to go a little more in depth here with nullification. Glenn is a former North Carolina State House representative and a student of the Constitution. He's a Marine and also works in the computer field. The 10th Amendment Senator had to say this about Glenn's time in office. Glenn is a true patriot and defender of the Constitution, and he's an exceptionally rare member of the North Carolina legislature. Tonight he'll be speaking to us on the topic of nullification, the 10th Amendment, and non-pursuance. The 10th Amendment was what gave our nation a decentralized political structure where power was checked by further spreading it between the states. So I'd like everybody to give a nice warm welcome to Glenn.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here today. I want to say that I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. I've always been very impressed with conservatives for Guilford County. One of the first times I had real interaction with this group It was about a year or so ago, we went to an event that was very, very liberal in nature. It was the March Against Monsanto. And they had asked me to speak, and I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to reach these guys? And then I get there and come to find out there's a conservative for Guilford County booth at this event, and we ended up picking up a lot of people from the far left and converting them to the right. We got an ovation for abolishing the FDA, so that was pretty impressive. Well, I'd like to start today to talk about the rightful remedy to federal tyranny. This is what we've talked about for quite a long time. It's called nullification. And one of the things I'm going to be advocating for is a slight tweak on the rhetoric because non-pursuance is the same thing, but it comes out of the Article 6 Supremacy Clause. If you guys have been familiar with going to your legislators or your representatives and asking them about this subject, more than likely they're going to turn around and say, well, Article 6 says anything the government does is supreme. Well, everything that is in nullification, everything that is in the 10th Amendment can be pulled straight out of the Article 6 Supremacy Clause. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off as talking about non-pursuance, the rightful remedy for an out-of-control federal government. Non-compliance, intercession, and nullification. This is intended to be a practical guide for state-level activists resource to address a growing federal tyranny. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time I've given this presentation, so you will be kind of my beta test. America has come off the rails. This government is a train wreck. As you can see, when you take unemployment plus workforce non-participation, we're looking at 62% of Americans being supported by the rest of us. That's 62%. Most of those want work and can't find it. Some of those aren't even looking anymore. And then down here what you'll see, if you look at the income growth over time stacked on top of the dollar value, income growth has expanded a little bit, but the dollar value has decreased by enough to actually reduce our purchasing power by 12% just over the last 10 years. Now this comes out of Federal Reserve monetary policy abrogating the Constitution, and this is one of the reasons why we're looking at restoring constitutional government. The problem, America has largely abandoned the U.S. Constitution altogether. Our legislators, our lawmakers don't even know what it says, and if they do read it, they don't even know what it means in plain English, which is a problem. This is what we have to address. Congress writes policies based on what's popular and what's feel-good. Not at all based on what they're allowed to do according to the Constitution. The policies that Congress passes are largely media-driven. They're proposed by lobbyists and special interests, and then it goes to the court of the media, and if the media can make a big enough deal of it, then it becomes law. The U.S. Supreme Court is also ideologically driven rather than constitutionally driven. And this was an issue that came back up in 1803 with Justice John Marshall creating judicial review out of thin air. The voting public, by and large, either does not know or does not care that our country has gone off the rails, that we've forgotten the Constitution, and that our federal government is blatantly disobeying the law. So this is a big part with education. The people of America have to know what the Constitution actually says if we expect them to vote for representatives that are going to obey the Constitution. Most Americans don't know what the Constitution says. It's not taught in their schools anymore. I was very lucky to have a U.S. history professor and a social studies professor that taught that to me when I was young. Some Americans outright reject the Constitution. The far radical left that has their own agenda, when you get into a debate with them and you talk about what is and isn't constitutional, they don't care. They don't really care if it's constitutional, the right to bear arms. They want to ban them anyway. And that's another issue that we have to deal with some of our elected officials. And officials overwhelmingly misinterpret the Constitution in order to get what they want out of it and not what America needs. The long walk from constitutional compliance started in 1803 when Justice John Marshall created judicial review out of thin air. Prior to 1803, it was left to the states to determine constitutionality and the U.S. Supreme Court to resolve disputes that took place between the states. Washington rejecting constitutional compliance accelerated rapidly under Woodrow Wilson from 1913, and then again in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Now, how do we get back on track? How do we restore constitutional government? First of all, we have to elect constitutional officials regardless of their party or their caucus. Whether they're Republicans, Democrats, not that I've really seen a lot of Democrats that want to obey the Constitution, but we have to look at constitutional compliance first. Because if we always look at party first, we're going to end up in the same place that we've been. Because all of us want to obey the Constitution, right? But we vote Republican first, and we end up with Republicans that walk away from it every time. So we have to focus on constitutional obedience first and foremost. We have to connect economic recovery to restoration. And I'll be getting into the 10th Amendment here in a little bit. But when we have a bill that helps to work to restore the constitutional order, one of the things we can do to increase the popularity of that is tie that to economic recovery. So if we have a bill that eliminates the Federal Reserve, we can call it the Sound Money and Good Finances Act or what have you, so that when it passes, the economy picks up, all of a sudden everyone says, hey, my wallet's better, I want to restore more Constitution. You have to reach people where they live and the things that mean a lot to them. In a severe crisis, we have to realize that we must abandon the status quo. The status quo is what got us to this point in the first place. And there are too many voters out there that know we have to change, but they're too afraid of walking away from the status quo and nothing ever gets done. We have to fill the legislatures with people who will stand up on principle, who will stand for the Constitution regardless of where their caucus may be going. And this is something that I want to stress to folks. The state legislatures right now, at this point in time, are more important than Washington, D.C. In fact, they're supposed to be more important than Washington, D.C. all the time, because all the power is supposed to be vested at the state level. However, the federal government is not doing anything to correct the current crisis that we face, and we have to take that power back, and that starts in the states. We can send an entire congressional delegation to Washington, D.C. from North Carolina and get nothing done. Spending the same amount of money, winning the same number of votes, we can fill up the North Carolina General Assembly and write our own ticket. That is critical. That is absolutely critical. We have to demand real legislation to assert the constitutional balance of power. Almost everyone here is opposed to Common Core, and we were very happy to see that the Common Core Study Committee had released a bill to create a new committee to consider possibly adjusting standards going forward. Well, I honestly, I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't want a Republican version of Common Core any more than I wanted the Democratic version of Common Core. You know? So we have to make sure and hold our legislators accountable and make sure that amendments are produced to make this bill effective, and to give this committee, if that's how we're going to do it, the power to walk away from the data mining and the race to the top funds and everything else that is causing us to come into this Common Core madness. Read the Constitution and speak up at meetings. I mean, if this is something that I'm sure almost every member in this room has a copy of the Constitution either with them or at home. That's just the kind of folks we are. We're unusual. Well, what I'd like to encourage everyone to do is to read the Constitution and read it again and become extremely familiar with it, so that when you come to public meetings, when you go to a town hall, when you go talk to your congressman, and you have the ability to cite the Constitution, that's going to surprise them because they don't know it themselves. And then you can tell them what the Constitution requires in a situation, and that's going to have an impact on how they drive policy. So know the Constitution, read it, and speak up at meetings. And this is big. We have to change the environment from the bottom up. We cannot neglect our municipal races, our county races, our state races. This is something I've been involved in since 2007, and I've seen this with every group I've interfaced with time and time again. The federal races are exciting. They're big news. They get all over the television. Everyone gets involved, and it's wonderful. But the federal races are not where the change takes place. The change takes place at the state, county, and municipal level. This is something I hope we can all remember. And we can save America if we work together. So what exactly can we do? We cannot rely on the Supreme Court. We already know the Supreme Court gets it wrong more often than they get it right. Look at what Chief Justice John Roberts did with the PPACA. He just arbitrarily turned a penalty into a tax and claimed that it was constitutional. That never came out of Congress, you know. And going back earlier, and these are some more controversial subjects, if you look at the original Plessy v. Ferguson decision in the Supreme Court that allowed segregation, obviously this was a bad decision. It had to be overturned. Well, what overturned it? Brown v. Board of Education. Well, Brown v. Board used the wrong idea to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson needed to be overturned, but what Brown v. Board did was they created a new idea of group rights out of thin air. Instead of going to Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, there's that thing again, instead of going right out of there and determining that everyone had an individual right, that rights belong to people, they said, okay, now we're going to pretend that rights belong to groups, and if this group is not being treated equally to this group, then we're going to have a problem. Well, that's created a lot of problems down the road. The ultimate minority is the individual. If all individuals have to be equal, that takes care of everything. You don't have to create rights out of thin air. And then what that did, by creating this whole thing out of group rights, we ended up with affirmative action that creates tension on both sides and all these other things down through history. So even when the U.S. Supreme Court gets it right, they get it wrong. So we cannot rely on the Supreme Court. The framers put it up to the states. Prior to 1917, I think it was, or 13 was it, with the 17th Amendment, the U.S. senators were actually chosen by the General Assemblies of each individual states. Well, from our perspective now, that sounds like a nightmare. I mean, who would the General Assembly have picked for our U.S. senator in this last race? It's certainly not the guy we wanted. But when it's in context, when the checks and balances are operating properly, that's actually how it's supposed to be. Because what happens is the states then have direct influence on their U.S. senators. If the states don't like something the federal government's doing, they go to their U.S. senator and say, hey, you fix this, or you're not going back to the Senate next time. And well, we can't do that anymore. So that check and balance was taken away. The check and balance that remained was the 10th Amendment. That's the last remaining check and balance that creates that proper frame of power. The states must declare non-pursuance, non-compliance, nullification. Non-pursuance comes out of Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, where it says that those laws that are pursuant to the text of the U.S. Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Logically, that means if they don't follow from the text of the Constitution, then they're not the supreme law of the land. If they're not the supreme law of the land, we can say that we will not comply with this law. And then if the federal government continues to bully us, then we can go on to full nullification and interposition. We need to introduce and pass a bill addressing the proper balance of congressional power, constitutional power. And this starts with non-pursuance, non-compliance, and nullification and intercession. And what can we do right now, at this moment? We can contact friendly legislators and senators and build a personal relationship. If you don't have a relationship with at least one person in Raleigh in the General Assembly, then that's something that we probably need to correct. We need to have a relationship with someone up there so that they know who we are, and we can tell them the kinds of policies that we want to see activated in the state of North Carolina. We need to coordinate a touch campaign with enough friendlies to build a majority. Mark was talking about firearms freedom and how many co-sponsors it got. I mean, we got enough co-sponsors that we would have had a majority to pass these bills, but they're not being allowed to get out of committee. They're not being allowed to be heard on the floor. This was an issue that I had in 2011. The one bill that they allowed me to hear passed unanimously. So, I mean, obviously I'm terribly controversial. But we have to build these relationships. We have to reach out and touch other legislators who are friendly to our cause and keep them front and center on these issues, because the more they are annoyed by our presence, the more they're going to push leadership to get these bills out of committee and onto the floor so that we get things done. We need to propose legislation for support and openly discuss with the legislator and the stakeholders how to achieve those goals. It's more than just your elected official who's going to be involved in getting bills passed. There's also stakeholders. This is part of the language of Raleigh that we have to understand. They don't bring any law to the floor or put it up to a vote without, I hate to say it this way, but without consulting with the lobbyists first, and the sheriff's associations and all the special interests. So in addition to getting the legislators on board, we have to start interfacing with these special interest groups, and we have to start getting them on board with some of our policies. And what that's going to do is it's going to grease the wheels, and things are going to start moving. And what we'll see as I get a little bit further down here is that North Carolina is not one of the first states to take a look at nullification recently. It's 49th out of 50. We have to build public and popular support for bills that have been introduced. One of the issues that we have on the right that we have to address is we let the left frame the debate. We let them frame the debate, and every time we go after them, we're on their home turf. And that's why we keep losing ground. We have to learn to reframe the debate ourselves. That's part of what I'm talking about when I say let's call it non-pursuance over nullification. Nullification is what it is. Nullification is the correct term for what we're doing. However, when we talk about non-pursuance, it takes all the baggage away. Because there was a right way to do nullification and a wrong way to do nullification. Madison did it the right way, Jefferson did it the right way, but John C. Calhoun did it the wrong way. But as soon as you mention the N-word, then, oh, you want to bring back Jim Crow and you're a racist and you're trying to do this, and none of it could be further from the truth. But if we talk about non-pursuance and we go straight to the Article 6 Supremacy Clause, it takes all that baggage away. It takes all the objections away. They can't go back to the Supremacy Clause and say, hey, but the Supremacy Clause, no, I'm arguing from the Supremacy Clause. And what that does is it helps build public support because it removes the objections. And it makes the media, the people who are pushing these objections, look silly. And we also need to reward the legislators who support our ideas. If we have a legislator that's brave enough to introduce a nullification bill, or actually active enough to get movement on these bills, then we need to thank them and we need to give to their next campaign because we want them to stay. And unfortunately right now politics is all about money and re-election. So when we get people who are doing what we want them to do, it's up to us to make sure that they stay there over the next election. What can we keep doing? We can promote a proper balance of power as the health of the American Republic. We're not trying to take out the federal government. I mean, that's absurd. We're here because we love America, right? You know, we're not trying to stop Washington, D.C. and put them down. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make them operate correctly. Because when Washington, D.C. operates correctly under the paradigm that they belong, and the states operate correctly, claiming the powers that we're supposed to have, then things work properly. People become more free, and people become more prosperous. We're doing this because we're trying to help the health of the federal government. If you have a guy that can only carry 50 pounds, throwing 500 pounds on him, it's going to hurt him, you see. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to destroy the American government, we're trying to fix it. Strictly constitutional policy will restore sanity to American government. I think pretty much everyone here is going to agree with that. The framers made the states to enforce the Constitution, not the Supreme Court. John Marshall just created that. It was never in the original idea that the Supreme Court would get to decide what was and wasn't constitutional. And it was because of things like the PPACA decision with John Roberts is why the founders did that. They knew that we would have fallible people in the Supreme Court. We need to push the North Carolina enforcement of the constitutional power balance. North Carolina rates a certain amount of power under the Constitution. Those are powers that are reserved to the states. And we need to be willing and have the courage to stand up and claim those powers and demand those powers at the state level and not in Washington, D.C. One of the big ones is education. There shouldn't even be a federal Department of Education. Education belongs wholly, exclusively, and only in the state of North Carolina. And one of the things that I think we'll see over the course of time is the closer we get towards centralizing and federalizing the policies like education, and I hate to say it this way, but the dumber our kids get. You know, so it's time to start reversing policy and changing course. We need to teach individual responsibility to read the Constitution and vote. Now, a long-term solution to unconstitutional government is something that I've been pushing for quite a long time, and it is a public education effort. The effort would be to try to create a civic duty to read the Constitution prior to voting. If we can push it as a civic duty, 90% of this education would be irrelevant. Even though, 10 people read the Constitution and come up with 9 different interpretations, whatever, if they read it and voted according to what they read, it would fix this country if everyone did that. So that's one of the things that I'm pushing. The parties will not obey the Constitution until there is a reward and a punishment at the ballot box. That's something that elected officials pay very close attention to, is the vote. And if them ignoring the Constitution doesn't affect their vote, they're not going to care. They're just not going to care. So we have to make sure that them obeying or disobeying the Constitution has consequences at the ballot box. And this is the good news. 20% will turn 90% of every election in the United States. A 20% vote. There only 10% separates almost every election in the entire country. So if we only picked up 15 to 20% of the population that was willing to read the Constitution before they voted, that would completely change the nation almost overnight. And then we were talking about the civic duty. Okay, and then measures to propose fundamental legislative policies. A joint resolution of the North Carolina House and Senate declaring a federal law is not in pursuit. That's slightly different than your traditional nullification bill. This is one step before it. What this would do is it would say, we as a General Assembly recognize that the PPACA does not follow from the Constitution, period, and we're not going to comply with it. From there you can look at more non-compliance bills and more nullification bills. But that's the first step, especially coming from the North Carolina General Assembly, where they're too afraid to even stand up and move. That sort of gets you through the threshold. And you can see I actually took a picture. The laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. And that's the key phrase in the entire Constitution. The entire 10th Amendment can be taken out of that one phrase, which is in the Article 6 Supremacy Clause, that only those laws that are in pursuance of the Constitution are to be the law. The state of North Carolina, well, this is just an example. The state of North Carolina resolves, therefore, pursue acts. Okay, as I said, this was still in beta test. But the idea is you start off with a statement that this federal law does not pursue from the Constitution, and then you come up with a bill that says we're not going to comply with federal law in this area for whatever reason. And then if you're still getting bullied by the federal government, you come up with another bill, which is interposition, which is if the federal government comes in to enforce this law against our will, then we will defend the citizens against the federal government. Those are the 3 steps that we're talking from non-pursuant to non-compliance to straight nullification. Now, the State Statutory Federal Non-Compliance Act, the first step that just basically says that this doesn't pursue, followed by non-compliance. Non-compliance is similar in scope to what what Colorado and Washington State did when they legalized cannabis. They just did it. They didn't say this is against federal law, therefore we're going to put police out here and do all this, which is what we've been looking at. They just did it. Whether the federal government objected or not, they said, well, this is now legal, and then that was the end of story. So we don't have to get into all these technical ideas and nullification and 10th Amendment and all this other stuff to actually have a nullification bill. All we have to do is pass a bill and say, hey, we're not going to comply with this. That's what Colorado and Washington did. That's usually the first step. We will not, throughout history, we will not comply with the Fugitive Slave Act, and then when they tried, they said, you can't make us. That was full nullification with interposition. You will not, something that we could say here today, you will not serve a self-signed national security letter in the state of North Carolina without the accompaniment of the county sheriff and a warrant. This is a measure that I've been pushing called the Sheriff's First Act, which means that all law enforcement activity in a state, whether it comes from Washington, D.C. or a city, has to go through that sheriff and receive that sheriff's explicit permission. And what that would do is it would make that unnecessary, because then the FBI couldn't walk into your house with a self-signed search warrant and start going through your stuff for no reason. And then we'll say we will not comply. A state bill of intercession versus federal enforcement. Now, this is once we've gone through non-pursuance, we've gone through non-compliance, and we're still having an issue. The federal government is still trying to enforce a law. The state gives deems that a given law is an extreme violation of civil rights, and they decide to intercede. So let's say, for example, the federal government decided to go door to door and start collecting firearms. And we decide that, hey, you don't have the constitutional authority to do that. We've told you to stop. You're not stopping. So now we're going to mobilize the police, the sheriffs, the National Guard. We're going to stand guard in these neighborhoods. And when you walk in to take guns, we're going to stop you. That's what intercession is. Agrees to deploy the police and guard forces in the defense of citizens. It bans all enforcement of a given law within the borders of the United States, of the state. And it defends the citizens from the United States government. That is the most extreme version of this policy. And that's the traditional role of 10th Amendment nullification. It provides legal penalties for banned enforcement. In other words, if a law is banned from being enforced in the state of North Carolina and a federal officer comes and decides that they're going to do that, then he's subject to penalties such as jail time or fines or even felonies. It provides tort for injury. If someone is injured during the course of a banned prohibition, then it provides the ability for them to be compensated for those injuries. It asserts the enforcement of correct constitutional balance of power, and this is the big thing. Once again, we're not opposing the federal government. We're not trying to tear down the federal government. We're trying to restore the proper balance of power, which is what made America great and prosperous in the first place. And that's absolutely critical. And that's one of the things that we have to be able to address when we're carrying this debate to the other side, to the left. And we'll see later that the left is more with these ideas than you think. But we have to let them know that we're not anarchists. We're not trying to destroy all government and run around like savages. What we're trying to do is to restore the proper balance of power that creates the greatness and the prosperity for the entire country. And it clarifies the role of the North Carolina state government. Because right now, in the absence of any such law, let's say, for example, that the federal government did decide to start going door to door and collecting guns. Does anyone in the North Carolina state government have any idea what they're supposed to do right now? No. There's no laws, there's no policies, there's no nothing. So basically they would sit back and watch and say, ooh, that's bad, and not do anything. Because there's no law.